welcome into another episode of Press Coverage. I'm Andy Anders here with Chase Brown. Ohio State landed the biggest commitment of the Jake Diebler era yet. I think it's safe to say their biggest commitment in years on the basketball recruiting trail. Five-star Anthony Thompson, the number 8 overall prospect in the country, keeping him in Ohio. Chase, just initial thoughts here. What do you think? You wrote the commitment story for this. What do you think the impact of this is for the Buckeyes and Jake Diebler's program?
Oh, I think it's huge. This is the adage that's used for the football program that the best in Ohio stay in Ohio. And for Jake Diebler to land in Ohio, and especially one of this stature, being the number 8 overall prospect, the number 2 small forward in the class, I think is certainly a statement for him, especially for his future in the program. Of course, Ohio State fans are going to put a lot onto this season for Jake Diebler to finally bring this team back to the NCAA tournament to contend for a Big Ten title. But there is promising signs of what the future of this program can look like under Diebler if he's landing talent like this. As you mentioned, this is one of the biggest recruits that Ohio State has landed in the modern era. In fact, Thompson is the 4th highest rated recruit coming out of high school that Ohio State has signed since 2000. And the only 3 players who are in front of him are Greg Oden, are BJ Mullins, and our Jared Sullinger. And those were 3 players for Ohio State that certainly made an impact, each to varying degrees. But you have to be excited about Jake Diebler landing a prospect of this kind of prominence and what his future can look like in the program.
Yeah, you're talking about in Jared Sullinger and Greg Oden there, certainly two of the probably the best basketball players Ohio State's had the last few decades. And I think when you look at the talent, you look at where Anthony Thompson is. I mean, it's the physical traits are so clear. 7'3" wingspan at 6'8". I mean, this guy. You talk about size at the small forward position. It doesn't sacrifice any athleticism. That length is so good where I think Ohio State has had some problems maybe in recent years defensively on the wings in certain areas. I think, and bringing that scoring versatility, right? There's so much that he can do on the floor with that length, with that athleticism, and shot 39% from three here at the Adidas Three Stripes Select Circuit. A guy who, with that height, can space the floor, which is so important if he's going to play small forward at the next level as he projects to. It's not enough you can say about the skill set and what Anthony Thompson could provide to this program. And you're right, it's a big momentum driver for Ohio State when you have, let's face it, a lot of fans out there are in at least a wait and see mode, if not very down on the program right now. We've seen that when you've missed these NCAA 3 straight NCAA tournaments, right? It's going to create a lot of negativity, um, and that's a battle. Like it's a reputation battle. I think that Ohio State has to fight on the court first, but in recruitments like this, right, where you need to get the fan base excited again, and the only way to do that is really through winning. But if you can do that, if you can make it back to the NCAA tournament this year at the very least, or maybe even go on the first Sweet 16 run in over a decade, like I do think there's the possibility of that with the roster Ohio State has this season. That's for another episode, but uh, if you do those things, these recruitments, these types of recruiting wins, now you start to actually have momentum for the future. And especially after a recruiting class, I think that maybe this past cycle didn't end up as impressive as Ohio State fans maybe wanted on the basketball trail. You get Amari Bynum, who's a really talented top 100 prospect, super exciting player, but your other 2 commitments are 3 stars. You lose out on a 4-star guy from Ohio and Dorian Jones after he decommits. There's some academic stuff going on, maybe some ineligibility stuff. Has to decommit, then ends up flipping to Rutgers eventually. So this was just a massive win on the recruiting trail for Ohio State, and now you have to start bearing out these results, getting wins on the court in the regular season.
Yeah, and I would say that this program has been in a position with recruiting where more often than not they're in on guys, but they end up being in that top five category, maybe some sort of extension of that top five, and just barely miss out. You know, there are several examples, I'm sure, of that being true that you could run down the list. And I know that this program is excited about landing future prospects. With regard to their competition in this cycle for Anthony Thompson, they beat out schools like Indiana and Kentucky and Michigan for this prospect, and those are big victories, especially for a young coach who is trying to make a name for himself at Ohio State. Recruiting has always been, I think, a strong suit for Jake Diebler. That was kind of one of the reasons why I think Ross Bjork was so comfortable hiring him after his interim stint that went so well. It goes back to his time of maybe even recruiting Darius Garland to go play at Vanderbilt, and to land some of the guys that Ohio State has over the years. I know a lot of them talk about the way that Jake Diebler built a relationship with them, established a relationship, and it was one that they felt comfortable committing and then later signing on the dotted line to play for the Buckeyes because of the person that he was and the kind of program that now he gets to lead. So I think that there is a lot of excitement, of course, generating around a prospect of this talent committing to Ohio State. And as you mentioned, the fit that he can have down the road when Ohio State's roster after this season is going to look a lot different. You know, Bruce Thornton's been here for 4 years. He's going to move on from the program. You've Devin Royal, who, depending on how he plays this season, does he stick around for another year? Does he maybe test the NBA waters? And plenty of other talent that has been brought in through the transfer portal. So to have a guy that's coming in as a freshman that can potentially start in his first season with the Buckeyes, will probably start in his first season with the Buckeyes, that definitely boosts your excitement for what the future could look like with Diebler as the leader.
Right. And not only that, you pair it with a top 50 point guard in the class, guy who was a 5 star, is still close to a 5 star, could end up a 5 star, but is certainly like an elite talent in Marcus Johnson there at point guard. Another in state guy. I think Diebler's definitely been trying to tap into those Ohio pipelines, keeping the best in Ohio. And you have that smaller, that guard who can distribute for the future. Now you have a wing to pair with it. Um, that's the foundation of a really good class, man. And especially in the transfer portal era, like you get these high impact freshmen, potentially high impact freshmen. Basketball is a sport where guys like this, you could come in and change a team so quickly. Whereas in football, so many guys, they arrive as freshmen. It takes a year or two for development to occur. You have your exceptions like Jeremiah Smith, who are just, they can change the outlook of an entire offense the instant they step foot on campus. But in basketball, it's much more common to have that guy who comes in and is immediately like top 10 NBA draft pick caliber, can be as a freshman anyway. Um, or as a starting caliber player, a guy who's an immediate impact for your team, impacting winning. And to know you have that waiting in the wings, like you said, when there's three seniors who are going to be in Ohio State's starting lineup this year, Brandon Knoll at power forward, Christoph Tilley at center, and then, like you mentioned, Bruce Thornton at point guard. Plus, you've got Devin Royal, and I wouldn't even write off that John Mobley Jr. is a candidate to go pro after his sophomore season this year. Guy who like is as lethal a shooter as there is in the Big Ten, and that might end up being as in college basketball this year. The way he's looked in a couple of open practices I've gotten to watch, the way it was reported, and I was told by some sources that he looked in the Ohio State secret scrimmage against Tennessee. Um, John Mobley Jr. has had a huge offseason, and he's gotten a lot more consistent. Where last year it started super hot for him for three, and it kind of trailed off in stretches. I think he's finding a lot more of that consistency and more as a distributor and maybe scoring around the basket than he had last year. Uh, but to know that if you have major roster attrition, and you're guaranteed to have some major roster attrition after this season, assuming that Jake Diebler capitalizes and on some of this momentum and gets the right pieces clicking in the right ways to make progress for the program. Like there is the caveat of he has to be around to pay this off, and I'm not one to speculate like what needs to happen for Like there's going to be a lot of people that want changes at the program if they don't get back to the NCAA tournament this year, right? So that aside, to know you have these caliber of prospects waiting in the wings is so huge for the future, um, and a great foundation for the 2026 recruiting class. And man, like we've been saying, if they can produce the results on the court this year, these are the types of things that can really get Ohio State basketball trending back in the direction that it was under Thad Matta there in the late aughts and early 2010s.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up Thad Matta because I think Ohio State is going to benefit this season from some of the continuity that Thad Matta and Chris Holtmann were granted. I know the end of both of their tenures were not particularly great. Obviously, it led with the departure for both of those coaches that are now coaching at their respective Big East schools, which is kind of interesting. But I think that with Jake Diebler, you can kind of see what the future looks like with him at the helm. You're going to recruit some of the top talent. Again, last season, I know that Aaron Bradshaw and I know that Evan Stewart didn't pan out, but those guys had 5-star pedigree coming out of high school, and they wanted to come play for Jake Diebler. There are some people who view Marcus Johnson as a 5-star prospect as well. I believe he was actually a 5-star prospect when he committed to the program. He's now since dropped to a 4-star prospect, still ranked in the top 50. So Jake Diebler is showing a pretty good propensity for landing 5-star talent for Ohio State. And if you can continue to build classes and stack those classes in the way that he is, your roster is going to be very talented. He's also landed some pretty talented guys out of the transfer portal. And so the recipe for success, I think, in the future of the NCAA tournaments, you're going to need a roster that has talent with experience. So if you can marry those two things together, bringing in veteran talent from maybe some of the smaller group of 5 programs, obviously that extends a little bit further in the NCAA basketball rather than it does in football. But if you're able to bring in talent like that, combine it with young, fresh legs, fresh guys that have something to prove, I think that can be a recipe for success that a lot of Ohio State fans can buy into, for Jake Diebler as the leader and as the head coach of this program. A lot of it's going to hinge on how Ohio State performs this season. I agree. But to bring up a football example, like look how many years it bought Billy Napier to have some pretty great classes down there at Florida. I know it didn't end very well for Billy Napier, but a lot of the momentum around the program, at least for the sake of his job, was because of the recruiting classes that he was landing. So these are the kinds of commitments, these are the kinds of signings that keep you in your position and in your spot for a decent amount of time. And if Jake Diebler can put the pieces together and have some success here in the postseason, I think you could be seeing him continue to coach the Buckeyes for the foreseeable future.
It's a good point, Chase, and I think even you could say it about Chris Holtmann that signing back-to-back top 10 recruiting classes of his own perhaps bought him a little extra time at Ohio State with how the end of his tenure was going, and the pivot they made to try and focus on the youth that didn't ultimately pan out there at the end of his time as Ohio State's head basketball coach. But I think the last point I'll make too is that to win recruitments like this, to retain Bruce Thornton, Devin Royal, John Mobley Jr., I think speaks to the fact that perhaps Ohio State isn't as resource depleted in college basketball, in the basketball sphere, as maybe some others thought, maybe was considered. Um, I think it requires NIL investment, and not to say that Anthony Thompson or any of the transfers or any of the guys who stayed at Ohio State, like money was the primary driver, right? I'm not in those guys' heads. I don't know their full motivations, but also I have covered Bruce Thornton for years and I know how loyal that guy is. And like that, I'm sure that wasn't like a major factor. You have to do right by those guys, though. And that was an expensive thing. And then you're able to still have what it takes to go out and win a 5-star recruitment against blue bloods like this. I think there were some transfer portal misses in the offseason where like Ohio State maybe didn't get their A target at certain spots where they got a B guy or a really solid veteran from a group of 5 school, like you said. And it felt like, well, is Ohio State really going to have what it takes resource wise to compete with some of these big schools going forward? And I think a recruiting win like this also speaks to that. for Ohio State. And also, again, just in conclusion, want to shout out like how big a win this is for Diebler and his recruiter. Like you knew the reputation he had as a recruiter, but I think this is like the first real big signature piece of like proving he can accumulate 5-star talent. I know Marcus Johnson, um, maybe you include in that discussion too, but this was like a well drawn out recruitment against Blue Bloods. I think it was a real statement win for Diebler's tenure. But with all that being said, thank you all for joining us on another episode of Press Coverage. For Chase Brown, I'm Andy Anders. Have a great day, and we'll see you on the next one.